Hello and welcome. I'm David Hamilton. I'm going to start by talking about some court action that happened in Australia finishing last year. It was an action in the Federal Court of Australia where Parents for Climate sued Energy Australia. So the background was that Energy Australia claimed that sales of some of their electricity and gas products were carbon neutral thanks to their purchase of offsets. And Parents for Climate alleged those claims were misleading or deceptive under the relevant Australian consumer law. And there was lawyers at 10 paces for a year or more. And eventually, just before it was about to actually get into court for the hearings to begin, Energy Australia settled the action. That was in May 2025. And the settlement involved Energy Australia issuing a statement that Parents for Climate were happy with about what was wrong about their claims. And there's a link here about that. So here's some excerpts from their statement. Some carbon offsets claim to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by planting trees or forest regeneration. However, Energy Australia today accepts the scientific consensus that these offsets do not indefinitely remove greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuels, because carbon is stored in plants for a substantially shorter time than those emissions remain in the atmosphere. Storing carbon in plants is not equivalent to keeping it stored in fossil fuels by not burning those fuels in the first place. And greenhouse gases are harmful to the environment and contribute to climate change. While offsets can help people to invest in worthwhile projects that may reduce greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere, offsets do not prevent or undo the harms caused by burning fossil fuels for a customer's energy use. Even with carbon offsetting, the emissions released from burning fossil fuels for a customer's energy use still contribute to climate change. That sets the scene for this presentation, which is about what I call the net emissions fallacy. So what is net emissions? Well, it's a simple calculation where you have emissions into the atmosphere, and from those you take an amount of sequestration, usually in units of carbon dioxide equivalent. And it's an obviously simple thing. The idea, of course, is that it's kind of a seductive idea that it's a balance. Stuff goes into the atmosphere, other stuff comes out of it. Same kind of stuff comes out of the atmosphere. What's in between, what's one minus the other must be the total effect. It looks simple and obvious. Alas, it's not. I do need to say that it is within the rules. I criticize this net emissions idea right throughout this presentation. That's really what the presentation is about. But it is in the rules to make this calculation. The fact that it's in the rules doesn't mean that it's right, because the problem is that it's misleading. The number you get after you've done the subtraction gives you a false idea of how well you're doing with combating the threat of climate change. And the other thing I should say is that most people have heard about net zero, and that's short for zero net emissions. So we're into the same business really when we talk about net zero, in that there's a net emissions tied up. This article in the conversation is a really important and interesting one from some European climate scientists. So I'm now going to go into some arguments about why this is misleading, why it's a fallacy. I'll start with permanence, which is critical. Because if the sequestration isn't permanent, and by that I mean true for all time, then the sequestered carbon dioxide is a carbon bomb, because it will eventually re-enter the atmosphere and then drive climate change. So by doing this sequestration thing and claiming you've reduced your emissions, you haven't reduced your emissions, you've delayed them. So the concept, though, is okay if, and only if, sequestration can be guaranteed to be permanent. That's something that's very hard to do. I'm not going to go on about that much, but But there may be a few small situations where it could be close to being permanent, but growing trees are certainly not one of them. The trees get harvested, they die, they burn up in bushfires, all sorts of things can happen to them. They're not there for all time, far from it. So if you do rely on sequestration as less than truly permanent, it is a form of intergenerational inequity. The climate scientists who wrote that article that I referred to in my previous slide call the use of offsets, the net emissions calculation, as a burn now, pay later scheme, where we burn the fossil fuels now and our descendants pay for that later through climate change. So let's just have a quick think about how long carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere, because that's vaguely relevant to this, although even if the carbon dioxide has left the atmosphere completely, the carbon bomb still remains if you're relying on sequestration that isn't permanent. But anyway, let's look at the lifetime anyway. It's interesting, and it's kind of food for thought. So we're considering a litre of carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere, and what happens to it? Well, over the next 202,000 years, some of it remains in the atmosphere, the rest is in the oceans. The oceans is the primary sink for the carbon dioxide, and it takes 3,000 to 7,000 years, 3,000 to 7,000 years for that litre of carbon dioxide to be completely removed from the atmosphere. There are lots of different processes that run at different speeds under different circumstances. But while you're waiting for all that to happen, the way things are going right now, more carbon dioxide is being released as coal, oil and gas continue to be burned. And I've got the definitive reference there. So my second argument is about the carbon cycle, and it is that not all carbon dioxide emissions are equal, because burning fossil fuels is a more fundamental change than moving carbon from the atmosphere to land or back. So when trees grow, they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, turn it into carbon in the wood. When the trees die, the trees decay, and the carbon ends up back in the atmosphere, usually as carbon dioxide. So in pre-industrial land use, that release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and take up out of it was balanced over time. And so we had fairly steady, reasonably steady carbon dioxide levels over millennia. But now we burn coal, oil and gas, we're adding new burdens of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And so the levels go up steadily over time. So let me just expand a bit on coal, oil and gas, just to make sure we're all talking about exactly the same thing. So coal, of course, is the rock that burns. Usually it's black. There are sort of softer brown versions. There's a thing called peat, which is on the way to coal, much the same kind of stuff. Oil, of course, is crude oil, which it gets turned in refineries into petrol, which in North America is called gasoline or gas, petrol, diesel, jet fuel, and so on. And the gas, the way I'm using it, is not gasoline, it's natural gas that people can burn to heat their houses, heat water, cook their food, and so on. All of these are so-called fossil fuels. They've been underground, safely underground for a long time, and now we're getting them out of the ground and adding to the atmosphere, which is a more fundamental change than perhaps cutting down some trees. So this is actually, you can see this process, these two processes going on in what's called the Keeling curve. These are atmospheric measurements of carbon dioxide pioneered by a scientist called Charles David Keeling. He started back in 1958 by developing the method, building the instruments, proving that they worked okay, and starting to do these observations in Hawaii. And we can see here a wavy red line and a black line. The black line is the smooth average of the wavy red line. And there are two things going on. The first thing is the waviness. This is the seasonal cycle caused by the giant deciduous forests of the Northern Hemisphere. In autumn, the leaves fall off the trees, they decay, the carbon that was in the leaves goes into the atmosphere, the red line goes up. In spring, new growth comes up, new leaves are formed by the trees add on a bit of extra wood, that carbon comes out of the atmosphere to make those leaves and the extra wood, and carbon dioxide goes down. So that's wavy line up and down is the carbon cycle in action. If we weren't burning fossil fuels, the black line would be pretty well flat. It's the burning of fossil fuels that's given us that inexorable increase over that time, and it started way back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Scientists have looked at least two different ways of connecting the burning of fossil fuels to that rising black line, and both ways show that, yep, we can explain all that rising black line, at least until the last several decades, last 2 or 3 decades. We can explain that rising black line by the burning of coal, oil and gas. Since then, land clearing has added to the carbon dioxide in the air, but basically the fundamental cause is the burning of coal, oil and gas. And the final argument is a common sense argument. If something is going wrong, we just need to fix the root cause. You've got to identify the fundamental reason why things are going wrong and fix that if we want to stop it going wrong. And it's our extraction and burning of coal, oil and gas that's the root cause of climate change, as I've been saying. And we need to stop burning those gases, those fuels, if we're going to prevent the climate becoming ever more dangerous than it has already. So while we keep burning those fuels, the climate is going to continue to get worse and worse, more and more dangerous. The only way we can stop it from getting more dangerous is to stop burning those fuels, and we have to do some other stuff as well. But the primary thing we need to do is stop burning those fuels. So the focus on net emissions, or net zero, which is kind of its cousin, it's seductive, but it doesn't actually fix the real problem, because it doesn't concentrate on the direct emissions from burning the fuels. And so it ultimately ensures continued heating, and it's a curse to our descendants, because we will have left all those carbon bombs for them. So the implications of the fallacy are that time is being wasted measuring the wrong thing. And governments whose net emissions are falling, because there have been some increased sequestration going on, can convince themselves they are making progress. And we see that in a lot of places. Most Australian states and the Commonwealth Government claim some of the progress that's actually from increased sequestration, because they report net emissions. In my home state, which is Tasmania, it's a particularly big difference, because we have large forests, smallish population, not so much industry, so the emissions aren't quite as big as in some of the other states of Australia. And about a decade or so ago, we slowed down the rate at which we were harvesting trees, and the more trees are growing and more sequestration. So right now in Tasmania, if you do that net emissions calculation, you get to a negative number. The sequestration is bigger than the direct emissions. And people say, we're at net zero. Aren't we fantastic? But of course, the problem is that the root cause, the burning of the fossil fuels, isn't being discussed in polite company. So people don't understand that's the change we must make to give a safer climate to our children and our children's children. And here in Tasmania, we have a Climate Change Act, which is supposedly going to drive what we're going to do to help improve things, but it hasn't reduced direct emissions since its inception, and it's clear to us in Climate Tasmania that the Act has failed. And the other problem is, of course, well, it's part of the same problem, that the fallacy that's looking at net emissions as a measure of what's going wrong, of what's happening, it's allowed Tasmanian governments to become dangerously complacent. And I've seen several examples of that over the years, where government advisors have claimed we don't need to do anything, we're at net zero, everything's fantastic. That's not quite as bad now as it used to be years ago, but it's still, we're deceiving ourselves by using the wrong measure. That's the problem. However, sequestration is still important, because our atmosphere contains 429 parts per million carbon dioxide or more. That measurement is now 2 or 3 weeks old, and it is still rising because we're still emitting, we're still burning those fuels. We need to reduce that concentration to around about 350 parts per million if we are to stabilise our climate over the long term. It's quite a big reduction. There's a lot of carbon in the atmosphere between those two numbers. So if we stopped all fossil fuel burning tomorrow, which we're not going to do, we're too addicted to it. So we need to stop burning those fuels. It's necessary. We need to do it as quickly as we can. But when we do achieve that, it will reduce the concentration only extremely slowly because of the long lifetime I talked about earlier in this presentation. So we're not going to get to a safer climate very fast. We're not going to get to a safer climate at all while we continue to burn fossil fuels. But if we stop burning them, we're not going to get to a safer climate very fast, which is why sequestration is important. We're going to need to look at it to speed up the process of getting that carbon dioxide concentration down. But the bad news, I'm sorry to say, is that there are currently no mechanisms available for us to do that reduction, to get the carbon dioxide out of the air and put it away somewhere permanently. We've got no way of doing that at sufficient scale or reasonable expense right now. So we are leaving this problem to future generations of humans while we're still burning the fuels. It's almost the definition of intergenerational inequity, isn't it? So what should we do? We need to concentrate on phasing out fossil fuel use as quickly as possible. So petrol, gasoline, if you like to call it that, or gas in North America, diesel, jet fuel, natural gas, coal, all those fuels we need to phase out as quickly as we can. We know we're addicted to them. Current world events where the Strait of Hormuz is blocked is emphasizing to all of us how much we rely on those fuels and how good it will be if we can get ourselves off those fuels by looking to cleaner sources of energy. We should separately measure and report direct emissions and sequestration. Why? Well, because they're both important. Direct emissions is what's driving climate change. Sequestration is what we need to improve to clean up our act, to clean up our atmosphere. We need to get the direct emissions down and the sequestration up. So let's separately measure and report them. If we take one from the other, which is the net emissions fallacy, we're misleading what's going on. Just measure them separately, report them separately, drive the direct emissions down and the sequestration up. And because our emphasis, well, we're still using so much of it, needs to be on the fossil fuel, let's just measure it directly. Don't bother calculating emissions, which can get slightly messy. Just measure the fossil fuel. So if you're a diesel user, measure your litres of diesel and work on getting it down towards zero as quickly as you're able to. Some people will be able to do it quicker than others. That's just life. But if all of us work on getting these things down, we'll make progress. And we might be surprised by how much progress we actually end up being able to make. And we will getting a better world for our children and their children. But anyway, back onto the idea of just measuring them directly. It's simpler and easier to understand than looking at emissions, and there's no confusion about what it is that we're measuring. We are measuring something that's important, how much of the fuel we're using, and we're looking at how we're getting it down. Another thing that we can do in the short term, which is slightly off topic for this presentation, but it is a useful thing to do, so I'm putting it in this slide, is that there are some other greenhouse gases which produce warming more warming than carbon dioxide, but live in the atmosphere for a lot shorter time. And methane, the main component of natural gas, is the biggest of one of these. So it's more warming than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for a short time only. So, decades rather than centuries. So if we can get rid of our emissions of methane, and there's quite a lot of it, then we will reduce warming quite quickly. So it's a very useful thing to do to stop making the climate quite as dangerous as it's heading by focusing on methane. So that's a final recommendation for us to do, of things for us to do. So thank you very much for listening. This is a challenge for all of us to deal with climate change. If we work together and understand what needs to be done, we can do this. and thank you again.